Traditionally, historians saw the 4th century through the lens of the sack of Rome in 410 as a period of decline. In 410, the city of Rome was pillaged and partly burned by the Visigoths, a tribe of barbarians who had entered the empire across the Danube in the Balkans. This was a cataclysmic event, and it ushered in successive crises in the Western Empire that would lead to its collapse. This weakness of the Western Empire is partly military, partly political, and partly internal, a result of weaknesses of instability, culture, and the economy. It's always hard to say why empires fall in some absolute sense, even though we can see in retrospect the signs of their decline. One of the signs is the inequality among the rich and poor grows. On the other hand, this is a period of inequality, but also social mobility. There are a lot of paths open to barbarians even. In this period, barbarians become important figures in the Roman army. And indeed, the army is a path of upward social mobility, a very important one. Between 337 and 410, between the death of Constantine and the sack of Rome, people did not see themselves as living in a period of decline. They did see themselves as living in a period of real change, the most dramatic of which was the movement towards Christianity. The 4th century often is seen as a period of decline because we're focused on the collapse of the Roman Empire in the late 5th century. But obviously people in 337, the year that Constantine died, did not know that in 476 the Western Empire would collapse. They did not know that in 410 Visigoths would invade and plunder the city of Rome. No more than we have the faintest idea of what's going to happen 75 or 100 years from now. From their point of view, the empire had been restored. The empire, which had been endangered in the 3rd century by invasions, inflation, armed forces out of control, chaotic imperial succession, was now stable. It was clear who the emperor was. The barbarians had been pushed back behind the frontiers. Trade, culture, civilization seemingly flourished. And if we trust the impressions we have of contemporaries, both formal, written work, and informal, things like the slogans that people put in their dining room mosaics, for example. People often put mottos there. And their mottos are things like joyful times everywhere, or a world restored. People in the 4th century at the time of Constantine were optimistic. No more so those people who had embraced Christianity as the coming thing, as the religion of not only truth, but of success. Everything changes with the conversion of Constantine. The church becomes first tolerated, then official, and then finally the sole legal religion, except for Judaism, by order of the Emperor Theodosius the Great in 393. What is odd is, of course, that thus far Christianity would have seemed to be unlikely. Christianity would have seemed to be alien from the empire. And even if some emperor embraced it for weird reasons of his own, it wouldn't have seemed to have been the most favorable context for the preservation of the empire. And indeed, of course, the empire would fail in the West within a century and a half or so of the embrace of Christianity. And it's no surprise then that the English historian of the Roman Empire, Edward Gibbon, blamed Christianity for the fall of the empire. But indeed, in the 4th century, it seemed that Christianity was one of the forces that had saved the empire. And not only that, much of what was preserved from the debacle of 476 and successive problems of the preservation of civilization would be preserved through the action of the church. It is the bishops that represent a continuation of the Roman order, a continuation of the notion that there is a kind of educated ruler of local society. So the bishops are members of prominent families. They're often members of Roman prominent families. In terms of the question, what held society together, a lot of the answer has to be the church and its perceived mobilization of spiritual power. To this day, the head of the Catholic Church is in Rome. Until 1960, the transactions of the papacy were in Latin. The services of the church were in Latin, and Latin remains the official language of the Catholic Church in its administrative head. So the most faithful preserver of Rome and its legacy, historically, is the Catholic Church. And this is a paradox because the church begins its career, indeed its first 250 years, as illegal in the Roman Empire, and indeed there are periodic persecutions where people were punished, including killed, because they were Christians. The most faithful preserver of Rome, however, after the 5th century collapse of the empire in the West, is the so-called Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine Empire, with its headquarters in Constantinople. Despite the fact that it would abandon Latin for Greek in the 6th century and turn into a very different kind of political and cultural entity, the Byzantine Empire went down in flames to the Turks in 1453, still as the Roman Empire. That was its official name to the end. How perhaps the most successful multicultural empire of Western history, how it endured for so long, and why it finally failed. And in that failure, how does a rich, literate, well-developed society come to be destroyed by a more primitive one, primitive at least in the sense of material culture, economic complexity, urbanization, and literacy? So we begin with the first crisis of the empire in the 3rd century AD. If we go back just before that, the period of the good emperors, the 2nd century AD. So it's this period of the so-called good emperors against which the subsequent decline would take place. Now, I think we have some more doubt and hesitation as to whether any state, particularly any powerful state, necessarily represents a standard of virtue or happiness. For the poor, the smooth functioning of the Roman government was less important than it was for the propertied classes, because the Roman state, like most states, insofar as it practiced the rule of law, was set up to guarantee property, not rights. The Roman Empire was not organized to reward ordinary people. To different degrees and at varying times, it did rely on slave labor. Rome was an imperial power, and it was an extraordinarily tolerant one. But however tolerant, of course, Rome drew the line at Christianity. But it is still historically quite unusual that the empire should have permitted all of these other religions. Indeed, rather than regarding, say, the religions of Egypt as inferior, they simply brought those gods in. Monday, you might worship Zeus, and Tuesday, hey, if you wanted to, see if Isis was going to help you, why not go and see an Egyptian temple? Tolerance is a real virtue of the empire, even if it's limited. Real virtue because it's unusual historically. But it was tolerant as long as you conformed to their image of civilization. Like many great imperial powers, it assumed that there were certain areas of life that were optional. They were very tolerant with regard to religion, for example. But their definition of civilization was being like us. They were generous about that. They would make citizens of people from the Celtic lands of Britain to Egypt. But this meant conforming to a certain set of standards, beliefs, assumptions, and way of life. So we have a different idea of the state. We're more aware of the limitations of state power in past times. We're more aware of the discrepancy between the rhetoric of power, and no polity equals the Roman Empire for its ceremonies of power, its architecture of power, its culture of power. But the emperor, in fact, however glorious, however much in the 3rd century was worshipped as a god, his power was limited. His power was limited in terms of enforcement, if not in theory. To Gibbon in the 18th century, the Roman Empire appeared a marvel of efficiency. But really, how could it be efficient? The distances were so long and travel was so slow. This is an empire that took weeks and weeks to traverse. The thing about the Roman Empire that is indisputable and does not have a value judgment attached to it is that it was enduring. The Roman Empire lasted for an incredibly long time. It was stable. In the year 410, the Visigoths entered the city of Rome, this so-called barbarian tribe, and they pillaged it. This was the first time this had happened in the city of Rome in something on the order of 800 years. The empire itself by this time was nearly 400 years old. The other indisputable accomplishment of the Roman Empire is that it controlled the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean was its center, referred to often as Mare Nostrum, as our sea. Our sea because they controlled all of the shoreline of the Mediterranean, the only power that has ever done that. To live in security with respect to both outside enemies and internal disorder, essentially peace and the rule of law, was unusual, and unfortunately it remains so. Rome was an immense empire. It stretched from England to the Sahara, from Spain to Armenia. It had a common language of administration, Latin, and two cultural languages, Greek and Latin, understood by the elite from one end of the empire to the other. The cities were not walled until the 3rd century. Peace. The Roman Empire spent half of its state budget on the army. On the other hand, no empire this large could be held together by military means alone. It was held together by an elite that shared notions of civilization, that made certain sacrifices for the public good. Those games, the circuses, the competitions, the ceremonies were usually paid for by private people, not by the state, for example. It is an urban civilization with an elite that is urban. The cities held their local gods. They had local administration. They built aqueducts, temples. It was a cosmopolitan way of life. So it's diverse in the sense that there are many different peoples, but unified in the sense that the elite shares a common language, and even the city planning is the same. If you went to London or you went to Timgad in what's now the Algerian desert, you'd know your way around. You'd know where to find the marketplace. You'd know that it was laid out in a grid. You'd know where the law courts would be in relation to the temples. But it is an empire that is centered around the Mediterranean, and not just logistically or politically, but culturally. For the Romans, their empire included lands where olive trees didn't grow and where wine grapes didn't flourish. But those places were not places they wanted to live. They wanted to control them, but they were beyond civilization. So a government official on the Danube in what's now Hungary writes home complaining that, quote, "The inhabitants lead the most miserable of lives, for they cultivate no olives and they drink no wine." This is an impressive empire then. So its flaws. It has an imbalance between the urban and the rural. Not as great as historians once thought, but it is dominated by cities that depend on peasants, but that tend to drain the land of its vitality. Another flaw of this empire is its size. It works for a long time, and then when it doesn't work, this becomes a real problem. And then the army. The army in the 3rd century discovers that it can make and unmake emperors. So the immediate crisis of the 3rd century, which lasts from 235 to the accession of Diocletian in 284, is that it has dozens and dozens of emperors. Most reign for less than 3 years, all but one die violently. So the two things are linked: the power of the army to proclaim an emperor and the inability of that emperor to keep his power before the army or an army somewhere in one province or another rises up another emperor and kills the former one. It was an empire that was, according to one point of view, more cosmopolitan than it had been, according to another point of view, more barbarian. In other words, this was an empire whose Roman population was less dominant, partly through its own success in co-opting other peoples. Some of the peoples that it co-opted were not actually originally inhabitants of the empire. Particularly, this is visible in the armies, which tended to be staffed by so-called barbarian tribes, so-called by the Romans, who referred to them as barbarians. Another problem is the East-West imbalance, where the East tends to do better economically and demographically than the West. Demographically meaning population. We live in a world when one of the great threats is overpopulation. It is therefore not self-evident, although true, that for most of the time historically, most places have trouble reproducing their population. And indeed, we are starting to enter into a period of great demographic decline. The infant mortality, the low life expectancy, the death of women in childbirth, the prevalence of disease, and to some extent military threats of invasion, made it hard for one generation to produce children to replace itself. And this is true up until the dawn of modernity. So these are fundamental problems of the Roman Empire. The real question is, why do they explode in the 3rd century? And this is a question with any great empire. It's easy to point to the flaws in a complicated system. Often size is one of them, often bureaucracy, often overspending on the military. But some of these go on for a very long time, more or less successfully, despite the flaws. The immediate problems that explode in the 3rd century are invasions and succession. Invasions by, first of all, Persia. Persia is the old enemy of the Roman Empire, indeed the old enemy of the Greek city-states that precede the Roman Empire. The second invasion is across the Danube-Rhine frontier. The Danube and the Rhine form what the Romans thought of as a natural frontier with the barbarian states. That didn't mean that they didn't cross them. In fact, many of their great fortresses and establishments were on the eastern side of the Rhine, but they considered those as bulwarks against a Germanic invasion across the Rhine. Rome is fortified for the first time. There is a wall that you can still see in many parts of Rome, built by the Emperor Aurelian in 271. And this is a significant thing because until 271, for centuries, Rome had not been walled because it was not threatened. The fortification of 271 starts to indicate things to come, or at least things that we know are to come, namely barbarian invasions, just as the marginalization of Rome begins at this time. Rome in the 3rd century is ruled, if one can call it that, by a succession of generals, not members of an upper-class elite, but men who have come from the provinces, men who are not particularly well educated. They hold the traditional Roman elite in contempt. The Senate of Rome is the embodiment of that elite. The Roman Senate is a collection of extremely wealthy people from good families with extensive property and very, very fine education. The people leading in the 3rd century now are generals raised by their troops. One of the reasons that the troops both raised up generals and then killed them was that they tended to get a kind of reward from the new emperor, a thing called a donative. Now, of all the crises of the 3rd century, this is the one that leaves the most visible impression. There's absolutely no doubt that there are all of these different emperors and that the top of the government is unstable. The question is, how much does that carry over into the lives of ordinary people? One measure of the effectiveness of a civilization is that it survives, and even people don't comment very much on political instability. In a way, we are testing that now. For many people, the fact that the government is polarized doesn't really matter in terms of their everyday life. That's partly because all sorts of institutions are functioning perfectly fine. There's no problem of the supply of water suddenly or scarce provisioning. The one that might have affected more people than the instability is inflation. Roman coinage was silver and bronze, and based on ratios of these metals to gold. The ultimate standard of value was gold, but bronze and silver had attributed values in relation to gold. The need to reward the army with those donatives and the dislocations of the invasions led to tremendous government expenditures. And this was a society that did not have debt financing. There are no bonds. There are no ways of the government anticipating future revenues and borrowing money against them. That is actually an invention of the Middle Ages. This is an example of something that the Romans didn't have, that medieval cities in Italy pioneered. And it's a great advantage up to a point. Great advantage because it gives you leverage, allows you to do things now. How does a government deal with problems like this if it can't borrow money? It does what is called debasing the coinage. To debase, that is degrade the coinage, means that you just don't put in as much silver or bronze, let alone gold, and try to get people to accept it for its value anyway. So up until the 1970s, the American currency was based on gold, and dollar bills were called silver certificates. They said that you could hand this bill in for $1's worth of silver. It was, technically speaking, not currency. It was merely a representative of currency which you could trade in. And before that, of course, the coins were metal. Dollars were both silver and paper, with the silver one being, in some sense, the more real. It is in the nature of modern government financing that at some point the government could just say, forget about it. And even long before the 1970s, of course, the government didn't have enough silver for everyone to trade them in. Just as it doesn't have enough gold in Fort Knox to float the entire world's currency. It has a lot, and that's important, that there be some real kind of value or bullion or, bottom line kind of gold bars. But here, the government, so say the government receives in the form of taxes and stuff, 1,000 gold units, and it issues 2,000 units using that gold. The coins say they're worth a unit, but they're actually, in terms of precious metal value, worth a half. So it pays its expenses that way. It pays the army. It gets people to accept this money. But when those people go to buy stuff, they are going to find that the stuff is 50% more expensive because their coins are not actually very good. The governments tend to do this gradually, hoping that people don't notice in the first place, or that if the inflation is, say, 10%, it's not so bad. But once having embarked on the debasement of the coinage, this tends to get out of control because of the famous Gresham's law, an 18th century economist, that bad money drives out good. If I have good sesterces or Roman currency with the full measure of silver that they say they have, one full unit, and I've got other coins that say one full unit but only have half, I'm going to try to get rid of the bad ones and hoard the good ones and only spend the good ones if I absolutely have to or demand a premium on them. So therefore, there are all these crappy coins circulating like mad, and the good ones retreat into people's, well, they don't really have mattresses then, but into their store boxes or under their beds, creating in itself more and more inflation. So you have a fierce inflation. Prices go up, people don't know the value of things, they start bartering, and the Roman economy is very, very adversely affected, as hyperinflation tends to. And A final problem is the ruin of the local elite, partly because of this economic chaos, but partly from deeper causes. The importance of this is that the empire could not be held together, really, by the government. However big the government was, it required the cooperation of wealthy people with ties to their native city. It was these people who sponsored games, civic improvements, maintained the temples, and kept a kind of local order. The 3rd century crisis undermines this elite. This elite is undermined by the militarization of society. They are to some extent ruined by taxation and increased taxation. They're just powerful enough to be well off, but not powerful enough to evade taxation. But they also tend to be undermined by an empire that's more cosmopolitan, where local elites don't matter as much, where, for example, military people who move around a lot are more important. And when the local elites are ruined, so is local religion. And local religion means polytheism. If I am of a grand family of, let's say, the city of Sardis in Asia Minor, in modern Turkey, and I feel that my ancestors have always been involved in the worship of the goddess Cybele, I'm going to feel very loyal to that local deity. But if I come from North Africa and I'm in Sardis because that's where my army is, I'm not going to care about some local. It's just like this local cult, and you know, you don't understand it and you don't care. So the kind of things you will care about, we'll see religiously, but they will tend to be religions that cross borders, like Christianity, religions that are not identified with one place and one God in the sense of local God, local temple, my people. So into this mess, Diocletian defeats his predecessor, Carinus, in battle. In 284, Diocletian is a general. In 284, it would have seemed like more of the same. But Diocletian rules until 305, and he abdicates. He passes the power to someone else. He is, however, very typical of the military class of the empire. He came from nowhere socially. He was the son of an ex-slave from Dalmatia, modern coastal Croatia. You can still see his palace in the Croatian city of Split on the Adriatic, his retirement palace, actually. Under his severe guidance, the empire was reformed. Diocletian was not a great general, but he was a brilliant manager, and he was a brilliant bureaucratic organizer. Diocletian is responsible for the militarization of society, that is, building society around the army in order to protect it, and he is responsible for a more efficient and ultimately burdensome form of taxation. The two are linked because you have to pay to have a large and effective military. The size of the army grew, probably doubled, maybe just as a ballpark figure, from 200,000 troops to 400,000 troops. This is a major increase that had to be paid for, and it had to be paid for by taxation. Ultimately, it looks as if Diocletian didn't so much increase taxation as increase the efficiency of its collection. In order to increase the efficiency of his collection, he had to increase the bureaucracy charged with monitoring the taxes. And that means, first, making an inventory of taxable resources. There is no income tax in this society because it's an economy based more on land than on salaries. Income tax is easy because you can keep records of what people are earning. The government to this day finds it much easier to take a portion of your wages because it knows from your company what you're being paid. If your wealth is in property, it's hard to put a value on that. You own estates. You have people who are free tenants who rent land from you and pay you in money or produce or labor. You have some slaves. You have a water mill. How do you pay taxes on all of this stuff? the opportunities for evasion are greater. So the first bureaucratic task was just to have a lot of people who could value things, who could come into a territory and say, okay, this farm is worth so much, and it has these many people. They develop a system to evaluate productive units of things like land and population, and to tax them according to a formula. A second means, once you have this taxation system in place, of bringing the empire together and dominating it more, is to have the army really have a first call on the resources of the state. We now start to have a state supply system for the army alone. This allows the state to avoid dealing with that debased currency. So, for example, the state just goes in and takes wheat and gives it to the army without taking money, buying wheat, giving that to the army. Diocletian binds the empire together also very effectively by a postal system. Post, in this case, meaning a system of riders, horses, communications that allows the emperor to go faster than anyone else, to have news quicker than anyone else, to send orders quicker than anyone else. And also more punishment for things like tax evasion. It's not just that people get killed for not paying their taxes, or imprisoned, or tortured, but that groups are responsible. It's not only that if I don't pay my taxes, I get punished, but if you and I live in the same village and you don't pay your taxes, I get punished, or at the very least, taxed for the part that you evaded. Diocletian issued a so-called Edict on Prices. The Edict on Prices attempted to set a fixed price for goods, and if you sold them for more than that, you were to be severely punished. This is the kind of the classic example of the state trying to combat inflation by dictating prices. The government in the 1970s in the United States tried also to have an edict on prices. Under President Ford, there was a kind of administration of maximum prices. The problem with this is that it creates temptation for black markets, creates a version of what we were just talking about with Gresham's law of coinage. If you say that tomatoes can only be sold for $1 a pound, then those tomatoes that are being sold for $1 a pound in a climate of severe inflation will be terrible, will be rotten. If you want to pay $2 a pound in secret, we have some nice tomatoes for you. And if you want to pay $5 a pound, we have some really nice tomatoes for you, all of which may be illegal, but the legal market is empty. And this is what happened in response to the Edict of Prices. This doesn't mean that the government cannot, it still remains debatable, obviously, the degree to which government can or cannot intervene in such things. But certainly in the case of the Roman Empire, this failed. What did bring back a measure of economic stability is the reform of the taxation, the fact that the state simply started getting in more resources, that less was being withheld by private people, and so the state could actually pay for its administrative and military costs. Diocletian divides the empire first in two, east-west, a very significant move that will have consequences for the next 1,200 years. He then appoints a co-emperor to rule in the west, while he rules in the east. This is really to overcome the problems of size, communication, administration. It's a statement that the empire is too big for one man to rule. But the chief emperors are also exalted now. There's no longer a pretense that they're just first citizens. The Diocletianic period ushers in a period when the emperor is distant. He doesn't appear a lot in public. He's a god. Diocletian is extremely important and in many respects extremely successful. He did more than just transform a tottering empire into a kind of tottering tyranny. He saved the Roman Empire. He saved the Roman Empire for 100 years. The Roman Empire, conventionally speaking, is thought to have collapsed in the West in the late 5th century. In the East, however, arguably Diocletian's reforms last for more on the order of 1,200 years. The Eastern Empire, the Byzantine Empire, would fall in 1453. And to its last day, it was modeled on Diocletianic administrative and military forms. People at the time clearly thought that they'd been saved from disaster. The 4th century is interpretable as an era of increasing gloom because we know that in the 5th century things are going to collapse. But people in the 4th century are not saying to each other, I'm so glad I'm alive in the 4th century because I don't want to see what's going to happen in the 5th. They're just happy that the barbarians are back across the Danube and the Rhine. The Persians are more or less controlled along the frontier. Yes, taxes are high. Yes, the elite is sort of riffraff and not as well educated, and they're military people. But basically, things are working. Prosperity is restored to the people who had been prosperous before. The local elites have declined, but it's not so visible as it had been. But there are some changes that we can, with the proverbial benefit of hindsight, see. Changes in the center of gravity. The dominant places are now places that are military bases. They're great cities with all the amenities of Rome, that is, stadiums, gateways. One of the best preserved of these to this day is Trier in Germany. The reason Trier was great was because of the frontier. It was one of the most important cities in the empire because of the military, because of its strategic importance. And there are other cities that are like this. Milan, for example, becomes more important than Rome because Milan is further north. It's a good place to get to the Danube and to the Rhine quickly, whereas Rome is buried in the Mediterranean. So it's a durable empire, but an unwieldy and in certain respects exhausted one. This 3rd century crisis involves all these many different emperors, also has invasions from Persia, also has the first indications of barbarian invasions across the frontier of the Danube and the Rhine rivers. But it survives this first crisis, and that is the accomplishment of Diocletian. The second crisis, that of the 5th century, is similar in many respects, but more final in its results. The 5th century crisis witnesses the collapse of the Roman Empire in the West, the fall of the Roman Empire, and continues to inspire a certain amount of fascination and fear today. 476 is the conventional date for the end of the Western Empire because in that year, a barbarian general deposed the child emperor Romulus Augustulus, and instead of imposing another emperor, Odoacer simply wrote to Constantinople and said, we're going to be loyal to you. We will recognize you as the sole emperor. Constantinople, however, was far away, and while of symbolic significance, this pledge of loyalty by Odoacer had no practical significance. The Western Empire had, in 476, become a collection of barbarian kingdoms. We use the term empire to mean a multinational, very large state, ruled from one center, but consisting of many different kinds of pieces. Kings, and the term and title king is of German origin. Kings are very powerful, but over a more limited territory. So there is a king of Italy now. There would be a king of the Franks. There would be a king of the Lombards later in northern Italy. A king of the Visigoths, first in southern France and Spain. Who were these barbarians? And how Romanized or how different from Rome were they? We're using the term barbarians, which goes back to the Greek term applied to outsiders. People outside but threatening. The Greeks defined barbarians as uncivilized by reason of their speech, by reason of the fact that they're nomads. Nomads, almost extinct in our world, once dominated many geographical regions. and were frightening because they moved around to people who liked order and familiarity. They didn't live in cities, whether they were nomadic or not. Barbarians were illiterate. This is the Greek idea of barbarians. In the case of Rome, there is no single definition of barbarian society. We can say that Rome was overthrown by a warlike but not very fierce group of enemies. The Romans perceived them as enemies. The barbarians perceived Rome as simply a nicer place to live. But there is no Mongol horde kind of event here. They're not that frightening. The Romans had known them for centuries. Most of them were even Christians. Heretical Christians, okay, they're Arians, A-R-I-A-N-S, but they're not unfamiliar, again, even in their religion. Peoples who come in contact with those who are more civilized than they are, and by civilized I mean peoples who have writing, who live in cities, who have extensive trade and administration. The so-called barbarian peoples are going to want to define themselves against the Romans. Hence, among other things, many of these invaders are Arian. They use religious difference as part of their identity. They had been at the borders of the Roman Empire forever. Like most empires, Rome was at the one hand very aggressive and on the other hand thought of itself as peace-loving. It maintained the Danube-Rhine frontier as a kind of natural frontier, every so often crossing those rivers to punish German tribes who were probing the frontiers of the empire. But generally speaking, the Romans were not interested in what they perceived somewhat inaccurately as endless forests inhabited by primitive people. If we ask why the Western Empire collapsed, the simple, most immediate answer is it was taken over by German confederations, tribes. They came not so much as conquerors, as military recruits, or as allies, or as refugees. They admired Rome. They wanted to continue its institutions. They regarded Rome as rich and as civilized. The last thing they wanted was to still live in kind of little huts in the forest. They were not the bringers of a revolution. They were not even that numerous, amounting to some tens of thousands. Nevertheless, they ended Roman government, accelerated the changes towards depopulation, decentralization, ruralization, a less cultivated, less literate, less Mediterranean-centered society. So I want to begin the description of this process by the changes in the Roman army. So the twin pillars of the empire in the 4th century are army and taxation, the latter requiring a civilian governmental apparatus. The army was a problem in terms of the recruiting of soldiers. There was already in the 4th century a tendency to get the more familiar barbarians into the army as Roman soldiers because they were available. They were near the frontiers. They are supported by a system with the bland name of hospitality. Hospitality meaning that they're settled on the land of Romans, and they share in the revenue of that land. That's how the Romans pay them. They don't pay them cash. They don't pay them in plunder. They pay them in a portion of the tax revenue. So you owe a reasonably powerful but not quite powerful enough senator in Burgundy. You settle some friendly Burgundian troops on your land and you give them hospitality. That is to say, in 1/3 of the tax revenue that you're collecting for the empire, or maybe 1/3 of just your regular old private revenues. This may seem odd. Why hire your potential enemy to be soldiers? But there's a lot of precedent. Very often, empires don't really want to supply their own manpower. And the people who are the best soldiers are also the people who may in the future be most threatening. I don't want to pursue this simile, but the Afghan mujahideen were trained by Americans because at one time they were opposed to the Russian occupation of Afghanistan. As it happened, in retrospect, that had some bad consequences. But at the time, it seemed like a good idea. So in the 370s, a group called the Visigoths asks to be admitted to the Roman Empire as an allied army. In other words, the whole group will be federated with the Romans. And federati is the term given for barbarian troops serving under the Roman Empire. Why were they on the move? These are not really nomadic people. They tend to be settled in villages. They have dairy cattle rather than, some kind of a nomadic sheep or something like that. They're pretty settled. Nevertheless, in 378, they were on the move. We don't know why. Some enemy pushing them across the Danube, maybe the weakness of the empire. They also may have been hungry. Certainly, once they crossed the frontier, the Romans were rather inept in feeding them, in supplying them, and the Visigoths rebelled. Thus far, nothing incredibly new. What really was new was that the emperor came and with an army to suppress them, and rather to his surprise and everybody else's, the emperor Valens was defeated at the Battle of Adrianople. The defeat of Valens was not immediately cataclysmic, because even though he was killed at this battle, even though it sent shockwaves throughout the empire, in fact, it would not be this area that succumbed to the barbarians, the East. The Balkans would be part of the Eastern Empire. And indeed, both Adrianople, the city, and Constantinople, the even greater city, would withstand Visigothic attempts to take them. In 382, the Visigoths were officially recognized, and they were allowed to settle in the Balkans as federati, and in fact, they were reasonably useful troops to the Roman Empire in the 380s and 390s. What this does show, however, is the barbarization of the army, and another aspect of that is that the army tended to be commanded now more and more by barbarian generals. Two of these generals, or war leaders, magistri, Stilicho and Alaric. Stilicho was a Vandal. Alaric was a Visigoth. Alaric wanted territory, food, treasure from Rome. The Visigoths were moving from the Balkans into Greece, eventually into Italy. Stilicho played a kind of game with Alaric, trying to keep him in check in the name of the Western Emperor, but also negotiating with him. The emperors moved from Milan in the north to Ravenna, a little bit to the east. Ravenna then was in the marshes and impossible for a barbarian army to take. This is the last capital of the Western Roman Empire. These are the Visigoths then who are on the move in the 390s and the 4aughts. Eventually, Stilicho would be executed by the Roman Emperor of the West, and Alaric would invade and plunder Rome in 410. Alaric was wandering around the Balkans and Italy for 2 decades before he sacked Rome. The army, which had consumed so much of the resources of the Roman Empire, is curiously absent. Or maybe the army doesn't disappear, it becomes indistinguishable from the invaders. The army is the invaders. Now, within this, there are some real barbarians, the Huns. The Huns are kind of nomadic. They were interested in the Roman Empire mostly for plunder, and they didn't care if that destroyed the economic base because they weren't thinking in such terms. And indeed, they may have frightened the rather nice German tribes that stood between them and the Roman Empire. In the 450s, the Huns were united under the leadership of Attila, and Attila certainly threatened the Eastern Empire first, but the Eastern Emperor defeated the Huns. And in a pattern that we'll see repeated again and again, the Huns decided that Constantinople was too tough, that the Eastern Empire as a whole, access to which was more or less controlled by Constantinople, was too well guarded, and they turned to the west instead. Not as rich, maybe, but much easier pickings. They show up in Gaul in 450. They were defeated by an army of Visigoths allied with Romans. They then went to Italy. They went into the heart of the empire, sacked cities in the northeast of Italy. The one power of Italy willing to try to deal with Attila is the Bishop of Rome, the Pope. Pope Leo I, along with 2 senators from the Roman Senate, goes up to northern Italy to remonstrate with Attila, to visit the leader of this barbarian tribe in 453, to try to get him to stop plundering Italy. Whether they were successful or not doesn't much matter, because Attila died shortly thereafter of a brain hemorrhage. And with his charismatic leadership, the Huns came to an end as a military force. After this, the barbarian generals, in effect, take charge. The Huns are defeated, but the other groups now pour into the empire. The Vandals have taken over North Africa by this time, by 430, cutting off the grain supply to Rome. And indeed, they plunder the city of Rome in 455, in a sack that might have been worse than that of 410. By 470, the Visigoths control southern Gaul, what's now southern France. A group called the Suevi are in Spain. The Vandals in North Africa. A group called the Ostrogoths in what's now Hungary. The Angles and the Saxons in Britain. All that effectively remained of the Western Empire when Odoacer overthrew Romulus Augustulus was Italy. And in 476, that's it. And a more primitive, more warlike, more illiterate, and more rural period was ushered in. A little coda, however. In 493, the Eastern Emperor in Constantinople convinced the Ostrogoths to get out of Hungary and stop threatening the Eastern Empire and take Italy from Odoacer. Once again, the Eastern Empire is capable of deflecting barbarians into the West because they're too strong. So in 493, our friend Odoacer was overthrown by the Ostrogoths and their leader Theodoric. How severe a catastrophe was this? On the ground, if you were looking around in 480s, 490s, you would see a kind of accommodation. The Roman elite compromised with, negotiated with their new rulers. Another aspect of this era, however, is decline. The disappearance of ancient texts, the end of literacy, except for a very small portion of the Christian clergy, a more primitive architecture, the end of grand civic projects like aqueducts, coliseums, theaters, more homemade, crude building materials, fewer imports, fewer luxury goods. The urban population declines. The countryside of Rome had not grown enough wheat to feed the city for 600 years minimum. Rome was dependent on other sources of supply. The moment the Vandals cut the supply, the city could no longer support its massive population. When you multiply this phenomenon, it's not a surprise that the city's decline in population and that the society becomes more rural, more agricultural, more subsistent. Without a government and military structure, trade could not take place on the scale it had before. And without that trade, cities could not survive. Let's just look at Roman population figures. So, we don't really know exactly how many people lived there at any given time. But historians and archaeologists looking at things like food supply, public welfare payments, water delivery figures for aqueducts, and the abandonment of houses and of building sites. Probably in 5 BC, the Roman population was 800,000, maybe as much as 1 million. Early 4th century, the population had declined probably to 600,000. After the sack of Rome, 300 to 500,000. More than half of the population that had existed in 5 BC is gone. We can estimate that by 590, there could not have been more than 150,000 people in Rome. In 800, on Christmas Day, Charlemagne was crowned in St. Peter's in Rome as Roman emperor by the Pope. On that day, Rome must have had maximum, most optimistic estimate, 30,000 people.